Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to continue on from where we were last week. We're going to work with some of Battlefront Miniatures' cool new D-Day defenses. In this case, we're going to build some machine gun nests and an Earth 5cm gun emplacement. These models are sure to be a really great addition to your D-Day landing scenarios. Let's get to it. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors. D-Day Forces Normandy is now available for Flames of War. This cool anthology book provides all the resources in one spot to play your games for this exciting historical period. The D-Day Normandy Forces book has already had a ton of coverage, but one thing to consider is that Battlefront has also re-released several models and some really cool starter army sets to go with it. I think this is awesome, but what really interests me with the supplement is the line of defenses Battlefront has produced, so you can create your own version of the Atlantic Wall, Germany's last-ditch attempt to fortify Western Europe's coastline against the Allies. I'm fortunate to have a good relationship with Battlefront, so I was thrilled when they sent me their machine gun bunkers, an Earthwork gun nest, and a 5cm cannon emplacement to cover on the channel. This video is part 2 of my series on D-Day defenses. Previously, I worked on the concrete emplacements, demonstrating how I embellished them and built them for my beach landing themed games. Now it's time to move on to the Earthwork defenses. So sit back and relax and check out how to make these cool models by Battlefront into a piece of history for games of Flames of War D-Day. What would be your ultimate bucket list item as a miniature builder or model painter? How about traveling to the miniature gaming capital of the world? For exclusive tours, discussions, and events with some of the top miniature companies in the world, including tours of Warhammer World and the Warlord Games HQ. While we're at it, it would be great to throw in some stops to the UK branch of the Battlefront Miniatures store and visits to other wargaming companies. On top of this, we'll see all the major military and historical sites in the UK, including a visit to the incomparable Bovington Tank Museum. Such a once-in-a-lifetime travel event is no longer just a dream, because from March 7th to March 16th, 2025, I'm inviting you to accompany me on this incredible trip. This one-of-a-kind travel experience, designed for the dedicated miniature hobbyist and their spouses or guests, is now available for my viewers. Please check the link in the video description. I hope to see you on the trip. As always with resin models, I soaked each bunker and the emplacement in warm soapy water for 15 minutes. I do this to remove any of the mold release agents that might remain on the surface. After this, I give the pieces a good amount of time to dry, then move on to priming them. For this task, I used matte black airbrush primer, but a rattle can primer will work too if that's what you have. It's worth noting here that I'm also preparing a box of 5cm guns at the same time, so I can have an actual gun for the main emplacement. The cannon crew and their guns are a bit of a special case, as I'll be using straight zenithal painting on them, so I give them a spray primer of gray instead of black. With this done, I can begin moving ahead on the actual painting. One thing to note here is that with the exception of the cannons and crew, most of the materials on these models are supposed to look natural. This is good because it reduces the complexity of the paint scheme, but it's also kind of a drawback because you don't want to end up with work that's just one shade of brown. To help mitigate this, I decided that anything that wasn't actual dirt or sand would be handled by speed paints. I bargained that this would create some more visual variety and mitigate the brownness. if that's a word. One of the main tenets of miniature painting, though, is to work from the largest color block to the smallest. So first I had to tackle the actual earth areas. Getting out my trusty cinnamon brown craft paint, I apply this as a heavy dry brush to all the areas that have the gritty earth texture on them. Note that I use craft paint from the dollar store here, not high-end Vallejo or AK products. This is because I simply want to reserve the better quality stuff for more demanding jobs. And since you need a large amount of this paint, the cheaper the better. Over this, I now dry brush the earth grimy gray to imply sand or dried earth. With the large patches of earth finished, I continued by grabbing a small dry brush. I started laying down a zenithal effect on these models. First by dry brushing the logs, corrugated metal, rocks, and retaining wall inside the gun pit with silver gray, then straight white. For the 5cm guns and the crew, these get the same dry brush treatment as well. With the underpainting done, it's time to get out my Army Painter speed paints, which will do most of the heavy lifting on this project. Speed paints are definitely more geared towards sci-fi and fantasy painting, but with some experimentation, I've come up with a couple of mixes that get close enough to historical schemes to work in 15mm scale. First is Dunkelgelb for the cannons. To achieve this, I mix 3 drops of malignant green to 1 drop of howling sand. I then take this and block in over the 5cm guns, avoiding the tools and wheels. While this dries, I move on to the crew. Speed paints don't come in German field gray, which is really more green than gray. Fortunately, I have a custom mix for this too. 3 parts battleship gray to 1 of desolate brown does the trick. I need a small brush for this part to make sure that the paint stays on the uniform. But this stage went by quick, and it was pretty easy to do. It's on small scales where there's a lot of texture where speed paints really excel. And for the most part, at 15mm, these paints only need 1 coat, especially on the infantry. But I felt the larger surfaces of the 5cm guns needed a little boost to increase contrast, so I dry brushed them ivory to pick out the hard edges, rivets, etc. The bunker elements of the earthworks were next. These are made mostly of natural materials, but I felt I needed a subtler brown than the cinnamon brown I used on the rest of the model. So I used my favorite speed paint, Pallid Bone, to paint the logs and other wood elements reinforcing the gun emplacements. Unlike the rest of the speed paints line, I'm not overly crazy about their flesh tones. They just don't look right on scales like 28mm. But they're okay on 15mm with a little preliminary work. First, I used light flesh acrylics and blocked in the skin to provide a lighter foundation. Then I painted a mix of 3 parts Crusader skin to 1 part Warrior skin over the top. When it was dry, this looked passable. I was down to the minor details at this point, so I took out Grim Black and painted the webbing details on the crew and the cannon tires. It's now time to apply a layer of satin varnish. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, these are wargaming pieces, so an extra layer of varnish just won't hurt. It adds extra protection after all. And second, I want to line in the models with enamels, so I need varnish to help aid the capillary action of the panel liner itself. When the varnish is good and dry, I now gently moisten the surface of each model with a mineral spirit thinner, and while this is still wet, I apply an enamel panel liner, jabbing the applicator into the recesses, cracks, and around major details, and anywhere which would be in shadow. This lining in did a lot to build definition, so now it was time to base the 5cm guns. I've covered the process of basing Flames of War models quite a bit in other videos, and I won't repeat it here, but I will put a link up to it if you want to check out the process yourself. When the basing was done, everything was pretty much complete, So I put down some patches of Mod Podge and applied static grass to these, and then, after that, I applied some grass tufts of various sizes and colors. Lastly, I preserve all my work with a couple layers of matte varnish. And with this, the project is done. Now I have 2 nifty machine gun nests, a bigger nest for a 5cm gun, and a couple other cannons with full crew, ready to guard the beachfront real estate on my games table. I admit that these models are first and foremost game pieces, so I've not pulled out the stops. These models are significantly smaller than the concrete bunkers I covered last episode, and because of this, festooning these models with extra embellishments and details just wasn't practical. Despite this though, I think the results will more than suffice and make a worthy addition to my D-Day themed games. So now I'm off to get out my copy of D-Day Forces Normandy and prepare for some beach landing action. If you'd like to learn more about D-Day themed miniatures, please watch this video. If you'd like to learn about basing 15mm models, then please consider watching this other video instead. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment, but most importantly, please remember to keep building life in miniature.